there was a great coffee table book back in the 70s, I think, which you may remember, titled "How Then Shall We Live?" You know, coffee books tend to have, coffee table books tend to have a popular lifetime, and everybody has the same one for a few years there. And this was "How Then Shall We Live?" which is the question that we're asking here today. How then shall we live in at least three dimensions or three respects? One is the social issues that are involved with all this stuff. Second is corporate issues. The business, how is the business world supposed to deal with this in some way? There have been some fascinating changes in just that very recently. I think you'll enjoy knowing about them. And then finally, and most perhaps most importantly at an individual level, what do we do? How should an individual respond to these particular circumstances right now? I have collected some ideas about these. Very few of them are actually mine, so therefore I think you'll enjoy them. I think you'll be very interested in what I've seemed to have come up with. To recap some things briefly, we are approaching all of this with an idea of three different viewpoints or perspectives. For those of you on the ships at sea and on Zoom, I apologize. I'm a pacer and a wanderer, and if like a TV talk show, and if I could be in the group right now, that's what I'd be doing. So forgive me if I veer out of the frame some. Framework or viewpoint number one is from the point of view of an ethicist. A lot of people, particularly a lot of ministers and people of the cloth, love talking about ethics because there's a sense of right and wrong. It's not like a sociology exam in college where you're never going to be wrong. There's a sense of right and wrong. You know, I can see from some eyes that, well, you know, I found a way, but there are ways to do that. But interestingly enough, when an ethicist looks at an issue, even she will have to choose among a variety of different lenses. And I use that perspective. One, for example, is a rights, R-I-G-H-T-S, lens. You know, moral rights of dignity, freedom, and the corresponding duties with them. Another is a lens of looking at it from perspective of justice. What is just in this circumstance or condition or with these possibilities? There's fairness in process and treatment, and then there's justice in some degree of outcome, of substantive outcome. These are totally different ways of approaching it. Sometimes it's very important to have the one, like in, for example, what we just did, voting downstairs going on today, and the voting in the democratic, it is the process that counts, not so much the outcome. Something we need to be reminding ourselves nowadays. Other situations, it really is the outcome which drives the concern and the pain. It may be social, it may be distributive, it may be corrective, it may be retributive, it may be restorative or transformational, many different ways of perspective. Or an ethicist may look at it from the point of view of utility. What does the most good for the most people and is most effective. You know who tended in that direction a lot? Any ideas? John Wesley. Yeah, John Wesley. Do the most good for the most people as long as you can, every way you can, and so on. It's a very Wesleyan kind of concept. Anyway, another way that an ethicist may look at it is at an issue is what adheres to the common good for everyone. Clean air, clean water, police and fire, rule of law, parks. All these may adhere to the common good. An ethicist may look at it from the point of view of virtue, of the ideals of honesty and compassion, and in fact of love. An ethicist may look at it from the point of view of a caring ideal, C-A-R-I-N-G, a caring ideal of listening and responding to people in their particular circumstances, and versus just following a particular set of rules or following certain procedures or calculating utility in some respect. So there is no one sense of ethics anymore, really, than there is one sense of faith perspectives. Those become, I mean, the larger issues of a faith perspective is how exactly, please, do you make a faith-based decision? Exactly now. Is this like Justice Potter Stewart's definition of pornography? He said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Is that really what we how do you make a faith-based a decision of anything, which raises almost immediately, especially when you have these, the question of the role of faith and the larger amount of faith in today's digital society. We do know, and it is brought home to us very, very personally, how many people are frankly leaving organized religion, what we think of as organized religion. The numbers are plummeting. They're not just softening, they're not just dropping. The numbers are going through the floor of people who are leaving organized religion. Now, to a degree, I'm like Will Rogers. Will Rogers was asked one time, are you a member of any organized religion? And he looked and he said, no, I'm a Methodist. There is a role for it. I mean, there's a role for faith in this conversation. The question becomes, what is it? And more to the point, how? How exactly? How? Do you discern it? Do you determine it? Do you make a decision? On what basis? For what purpose? With what direction? Now notice that that I'm asking a different set of questions in a noticeably different tone. All religions respond to mystery, Roger Kennedy said, because they're about mystery. And ultimately, at least in my present state of development, I think these things are a great mystery too. And so I find that it's not nearly that antithetical. But it is the place of faith itself, as opposed to ethics or questions of morality. Difference being one tends to address values, the other tends to focus on action. Faith does both. Faith does both, at least in the Christian tradition. And but there's an old joke at this point about the early days of computing, when you could It was thought that you could talk to a computer and you could ask the computer questions and the computer would whirl and the lights would blink and it would come up with an answer. And so someone early on, a group of them, asked the great computer, "Is there a God?" And the computer whirled and the lights went on and the response came back, "Insufficient data to compute." So the guys added more computer power to it and they added more data and asked it again, and there was whirling and lights and the same answer, "Insufficient data to compute." And finally they added more and more and kept getting the same answer. And finally there came the answer, "Is there a God?" Whirled, and the lights came on and the response came back, "There is now." And the third perspective is of these guys who built the computers themselves. It's the technology and the producer perspective of who's building this stuff and who's making this stuff in the first place. Where do they come in? How do they make their decisions? Well, historically, for the last generation, that answer, which has included the explosion of computer power, data storage, and inexpensiveness. There's something called Moore's Law, which calculates back over, over my adult lifetime, the history of computing power and so on, that every 2 years or so, the computer power increases by a geometric factor of 2, and the cost is cut in half. And so you work that backwards to the Aiken Laboratory Museum back at my old alma mater, which had one of the Mark I computers from World War II, and that took up most of the museum. That took up the museum. And then eventually you get this modern stuff, and on this lectern, they can put all the, put the cell phones, which went from a World War II walkie-talkie down to implants in your eyeglasses. Most all of that has been driven by market forces. The business market. The business market. Make it faster, make it cheaper, make it more efficient, comply with whatever law there is, and make more things possible. Television, streaming, on and on and on. But there's not been a lot of focus beyond, can we make this, and can we make it better, faster, cheaper? There hadn't been a lot of focus on any of the questions we've been looking at in the business world up to now, because it's too hard. Well, why is it that they hadn't done it up to now? We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but the general idea is it's too hard and too vague. Too vague. I'm not sure what they're doing or why. So with all these things, let's start with social. Let's start with social. And the great question with social issues like this is who decides? It's the great issue of who decides. And I would add to that, you know what the real interesting issue is? Who decides who decides? Who appoints the decision makers? Because that's who you want to talk to. That's who you want to talk to. Who decides who decides is one of the great questions. All right, who decides what? The components, the characteristics, capabilities, how it's to be used, what happens with the data, with the actual information about you, which gets generated as a product of this. Who decides who decides? Now, but looking at that, who you think should? Remember the social compact. Y'all interrupt, y'all blurt out. I'll repeat anything for the help of the audience. Who decides who should? You? For your own device? Well, yeah, up to a point. That certainly is true, up to a point. But based on what information? There are some things that you can decide yourself about what you're going to. You can decide you're not going to post fraudulent, libelous, defamatory stuff. You're not going to talk trash on this any more than you do in any other way. You can set a limit for yourself on how long you're going to spend staring at the thing or what you're going to watch, just like you do with television. But there's a lot in this. How much more should you be obligated to decide? How many of you see these cookie notices that come across your screen? I see hands rising like green shoots of grass in the spring. You see all these cookie notices. How many of you read them? Some. I got one, some. Oh, how many of you don't? And I do this for a living. It takes time. It takes trouble. And the Europeans are behind most of this, and they are, oh, it has to be in plain and simple language. Okay. We tried that in this country, and the truth is, making it plain and simple is itself unbelievably hard because the terms of art have an entire infrastructure of meaning built into them and are shorthand rather than esoteric. That's why you use terms of art, so you don't have to go through this every time. This stuff is enormously complicated. It takes time, it takes trouble, it takes an investment of yourself in learning how to do it and how to organize all these various things, to understand it. Wouldn't you rather have certain default conditions that this is how it works, this is what it's going to do? Now, if you want to change it, you can change it up or down. You'd rather have that, assuming, of course, that the default condition, this is how it's going to work, isn't a problem. What about smart people? Shall we let smart people handle it on a kind of a meritocracy sort of way? I mean, that's what a lot of is happening in all this. So there's you, but like that wonderful YouTube clip from some years ago of the woman in Atlanta who just kept saying, ain't nobody got time for that. Yeah. But you ain't got time for that. Smart people, it's an issue of trust. It's an issue of trust, isn't it? The market, the market will decide. And whatever sells best in the market will eventually be correct. To a large degree, that works, but capitalism doesn't really take care of all of the exhaust it leaves behind the engine. What about techies? I mean, they built this stuff. I mean, as my brother said of a song that was going on way, way, way too long one time, as he whispered to the composer, said, sir, you wrote it. Can't you stop it? The techies wrote it. Can't they figure out some bounds of their own thing? Techies are absolutely great, but techies do what techies do. And what they do is they believe technology solves problems. So they will, as one commentator put it, apply the practices that solve tech problems, like procedures and checklists and measurements. Procedures for what? Measurements for what? Checklists in order to accomplish what? There's a void there that's not being filled. Not much interested in how to do something until I know what it is we're trying to do exactly. What about the legislatures or some lawgiver someplace? How much, oh, I can see from the expressions on your face how that just filled you with comfort, and I could just feel the tension easing out of it, floating out of the room. And you sit there immediately say, well, they're democratically elected, more or less, we hope, for the time being. But that seems very authoritarian somehow, doesn't it? All right, so who decides is the first great issue in this on which we have no societal consensus right now, nor are we likely to in the meantime. Decide how. There are pieces of this, there are components that are amenable to control. For example, we talked about algorithms the other day, which determine how, essentially, as Jack Dorsey said, who owned Twitter until the day before yesterday, algorithms determine a huge amount of what we see and what we don't see. And so that being the case, and it is, he thinks we need to have more choice at the individual level over how that is set up or organized. Okay. There is a concept that is very, very common and well known in the law, and you have experienced it in your own lives with these cookie notices and so on. It's called notice and consent. And the idea is we will tell you, we being the producers of whatever this stuff is, we will give you complete, full disclosure, or at least adequate notice and explanation of what we're going to do, what we could do, what we're allowed to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then you consent to it, either by opting out of what we're going to do or affirmatively clicking I agree and opting in one way or another. Requiring an opt-in will get a lot fewer agreements, but usually it's an opt-out. But this notice and consent is the most common thing we have. You see the privacy policies, you see the terms and conditions. Those are all notices. And you either consent by continuing to use it, or maybe you check something and so on. If you don't fool with the cookie banners that pop up, you won't fool with the privacy notices, and you'll never give a second thought to terms and conditions. Of course not. I refer again to the woman in Atlanta. Ain't nobody got time for that. But a wonderful, wonderful Harvard professor said one time, says, about all the notice and consent stuff? He said, this is all great, and I know this is how it works in the securities world, in the stock world, and all that before you buy stocks and so on. He said, but he said, my perfect world, don't tell me about all the awful things you could do to me and ask me if that's okay. Just don't do them. Just don't do them. Just don't do these awful things. And let's just save us all the time and the trouble and the energy and all that. I frankly like that idea. But choice is good. We want choice in our digital world. We want to have as much, because that gives us that sense that we are somehow in control. We have an autonomy to this somehow. But here's a question one ethicist asked about that choice thing. When X technology becomes a social norm, when it becomes, this is normal, this is what you do, then do you really have a choice anymore on whether or not you're going to use it? You really have a choice on whether or not you are going to come to this event dressed? Do you really have now how you are dressed, okay. But even then, when it is normal to dress at a certain level or to a certain point, do you really have a choice as to whether you're going to do at least that? Do you really have a choice? Which deodorant? Yes. But deodorant, yes or no? Do you have really a choice about that in most places you go? And at that moment, when you say, you know what, I really kind of don't, do we? At that point, watch what's happening. Have you just widened a sense of social inequality, because that now separates the ones who can afford it from the ones who can't? Or have you, and somehow, are you about to reduce that inequality because poor societies may be able to scrape up enough to institute this particular developed new technology and leapfrog over the more affluent societies that already have a huge infrastructure built around something that's getting obsolete? When fiber optic and wireless telephones became available, a lot of the developing countries, we're not going to bother laying down telephone wires. Tremendously expensive. Let's just put up, let's just go wireless, which is an absolutely fascinating kind of concept. But so decide how, and decide on what basis, with what standards. Do you controls, do you develop it or not? Some of these things are so scary, particularly in these medical advances when you're talking about gene therapy, that they're simply the relatively small community that deals with it simply put the brakes on until their ethics can catch up with them and their controls and protocols. To deploy it or not, by whom, under what conditions, with what requirements, monitoring, by whom, why, how, all of that is implicit the more the technology has adverse uses, the more it can be used for something adverse. You know who's some of the most sensitive of any group in the world about that issue? Exactly. The difference between good intentions, between monitoring intentions and monitoring capability for evil. Who's the best in the world at it? United States Army, United States military. You will not hear these spokespeople out of the Pentagon talking about other adversaries' intentions. They let the CIA do that. They worry about adversaries' capabilities. I don't care what you think they're going to do. I care very much about what they could do. There's a very different approach, and there's virtually no technology which cannot be turned for good or for evil. So, which brings us to the question of accountability. Now, accountability, everybody loves accountability. Everybody likes to, we got to hold them accountable. We got to hold them accountable. We got to do that. You know where that's the biggest problem? You know where, of all of everything we've talked about for these last 4 weeks, accountability runs right up to issues of faith head on, right head on. Accountability, where's the intersection between accountability and forgiveness, which is a Christian obligation? Have you ever been accused of being too forgiving? Think about that for a minute. It's a real thing. There are I mentioned, in the military, there's a very big distinction which the military recognizes between intentions and capabilities. Imagine people develop and deploy some new technology, I don't know what, with the best of intentions. This will make XYZ cheaper, faster, make it possible to do all sorts of things. But they didn't think about all the side effects that it might cause, didn't think about unintended consequences from wrongdoers having used it, didn't think about, did not put guardrails on it to prevent children getting hold of it and so on. Hold them accountable. Well, yeah, because vast injuries were caused directly by this. They are certainly in a better position. They built it, they can stop it. They were certainly in a better position to come up with these solutions and identify these problems ahead of time, certainly better than the rest of us, who we ain't got time for that. Nobody does. And so look what's happened. Hold them accountable, which, by the way, in an increasingly, in a world which has always been broken and fallen since we left the garden, but is now more dry, more devoid, a greater vacuum of ethics and faith and a sense of responsibility over and above the bottom line than it ever has been. That's the argument for accountability, either through enormous liability awards or through public shaming or through something. That's the argument for accountability. Where is the argument, and who is making the argument, and how powerful is the argument for forgiveness? Either in the law or in society. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
I understand that forgiveness has a benefit to the forgiver as much as it does for the person who's done something wrong.
And Diane's point that forgiveness has benefit to the giver as much as it does to the one who's the forgiven, I think that is actually absolutely true. And my sense of it is that forgiveness is all about the giver, all about forgiveness is about you.
Accountable to something or somebody. You take the IRS or U.S. Treasury, they're accountable to no one. Forgiveness part of it, we're accountable to God. So you have to be accountable to something. And, we've got some institutions that are no point in making them accountable. They don't have to answer to anybody.
Dee Dee makes the point that that everybody's got to be accountable to something. That the IRS, she used an example, isn't accountable to anybody, and that individually we are accountable to God. That is, this issue is one we may come back to at a later time because it's absolutely fascinating and while it has been a staple of religious discussion in faith-based communities for as long as there have been mouths and faith, no particular resolution has been reached, but there are some fascinating things going on now in a lot of the academies that are beginning to reach out to some of the faith traditions of forgiveness in their application to matters which are purely secular. And which is itself fascinating. The problem of arriving at consensus in today's world increasingly we find it hard to agree, as my brother put it once, on the color of an orange, much less on matters of values and procedures and so on. One of the big problems in the privacy world in this country right now is we have no consensus on what is and should not be private. None. We have no consensus. It is being fought over with, there's general agreement that yes, it's a good thing and we need more of it. We're all worried about it. We're all mad about it. That's thus ended the reading of the lesson. There's no more consensus, particularly on what to do about it. No idea whatsoever. Now, what about we turn from the ethics viewpoint, the technology perspective, now to the corporate one. Let's look at the corporate view. Why are they're just now getting with it about the major companies in this country are just now starting baby steps to get with it on issues of ethics and technology generally. What has taken them so long? Why is it only now? And well, there are a number of reasons in the literature. One is human nature. You develop these things for one purpose, and then you look up, you see, oh goodness, I didn't ever anticipate all these unintended consequences, these second order effects, these things that would be used. Do you know what the car was actually designed for? I just read this and was as blown away as the guy who was writing it. Medical reasons. People were supposed to be able, they would, as they drove along, the air would blow real much, and the air would be thinner and it would be easier to breathe and it would help their lungs and so on. Habit, custom, never done it that way. Cost, it's going to cost us to do all this. It's going to cost us to change. We're going to have new ways to re-engineer our processes. We'll have to have new ways to recognize people and reward and incentivize and disincentivize. You know, we don't know that'll take forever and it'll cost a fortune. And besides, we think we're ethical already. Never heard of a company that thought they were unethical. Heard of employees who thought their company was acting unethically. Yeah, plenty of those, but never saw decision makers who thought they were behaving unethically. That's very, very rare in the United States. And above all, they don't know how or what. Are they just about designing new processes? Or what? Now there is a movement toward doing this. There really is. There is a movement toward doing this. It is halting. It is difficult. It is episodic. But but there's a great interest in this in the larger corporate world. And where there's an interest in something in the larger corporate world, there will be consultants. That is the consultants are one of the great features of the modern business landscape. And so when you don't know what to do, you hire some 25-year-old who's never done anything to tell you. And that's the standard joke for all this. And so sure enough, Deloitte has put together, you know them as an accounting firm, but now they're consultants with accounting attached. Now they put together an entire group across the world that consult on the ethics of technology and the morality of technology and so on. And they have a list of 300 questions to ask, and they have principles and all that to go to. They have conferences and they have studies and oh, the PowerPoints are risen. And they'll say, and they have their own vocabulary. And they'll say, we're going to integrate this across the whole business cycle. Okay. We need to hire other consultants. We need to hire specialized ethics talent to jump in this and come in hot and fast and really see what is happening here. We need to educate at all levels and points of access. We need to have focus groups in the supply chains and be as wide and as predictive as possible. And we need to collaborate across the industry. More industrial psychologists. I love those guys. It is largely coming from the young people who are insisting on it. I'm sorry?
They need to create more jobs.
They need to create more jobs, yes. It is largely coming from younger people who are searching in their own lives for things they're not finding in their church. That's the short answer. It's coming from the youngins. And we've heard of immoral, moral, and amoral, one being good, bad, indifferent. I've not heard the phrases. With ethics, you tend to be a little more binary. You either are or you aren't. Morality tends toward values. Ethics tends toward actions, which are a lot more measurable and against some kind of standard. So I've not heard of it, but I will look farther because that's a very good point. In the late 1970s, the University of Chicago Economics Department, and in conjunction with its law school, developed an economic-based analysis process or way of doing it. It's called the Chicago School of Economics and so on. And the idea was this, as applied to law, that legal decisions should be made on economic basis, not just on what was most efficient, what would do the most good, all these things I was describing a little bit earlier. And particularly Milton Friedman, remember Professor Friedman, who was well known for his monetarist policy, said, easing up or loosening or tightening up on the money supply was the solution to everything. But he also was well known for saying and promoting the idea that there are, for the obligations or responsibilities of a corporation, there's only one, and that is to maximize the satisfaction of the shareholders. That's your only obligation. Therefore, if you're doing anything else, you are doing something which is beside the point at best, wasteful or worse. Anyway, you are to maximize the satisfaction of shareholders. That's your job, board of directors, nothing else. You have no other stakeholders. And if that means in order to maximize satisfaction of the shareholders, you have to close this, that, or the other plant and send the jobs to wherever in the world they can be done most cheaply, that's what you do, because that is your job, to maximize satisfaction of shareholders. If satisfaction of the shareholders means bigger stock price, more money, then that's what you focus on. If the satisfaction of the shareholders would include attention to other values as well, then Friedman would have said, I think, you need to do that too. But he was not, but nobody reads that far because, any farther than the soundbite, then I refer back to my lady in Atlanta. Nobody got time for that. So that suited very well the social, political, and economic zeitgeist of the 1980s, which focused largely on individual responsibility, individual incentive, individualized accountability, individualized reward, all of which has an important point, unless it metastasizes into, and therefore forget about everybody else. Nothing else matters except your reward, your stock price, etc. See the difference? See what was happening? That was from the late 1970s into very, very recently. That has pretty much been the way it is, and the way it's been taught in the business schools and the law schools around the country. But in 2019, 2018-19 is when we started to see, hey, wait a minute, you can have halos and profits at the same time. And you start seeing a pressure on major publicly traded corporations to do more than simply worry about the stock prices all the time. And again, I think much of it was coming out of young people, which is where a lot of this was starting to bubble up, and now it is happening. Dee Dee, Steve, and I started thinking about this particular program. When did we start talking about this? November, December, January? What's happened since then? War. The Russian invasion of Ukraine. Have you noticed that for all that we're doing to supply arms and aid and militarily, did you notice there has been a groundswell of people, of big corporations boiling out of Russia, leaving behind everything and taking multi-billion-dollar hits on their bottom lines? Why is that? To the point that the ones that are staying are now facing much shame and derision. You can see exactly who's who. Jeff Sonnenfeld, Yale, has a website. You can see exactly who's leaving and exactly who's staying and who's kind of in between and trying to have it both ways. Fascinating. Who would have thought that? And the effect of those sanctions, which aren't public, these are private actors, privately acting and putting money where their mouths are. First, opening their mouths, and second, backing it up with money, is extraordinary. And it marks an absolutely astonishing change from 1979. From the old Chicago school, you have one obligation only, and that's your shareholders. Absolutely fascinating. It's not without moral questions there too. Can Procter & Gamble still sell baby formula in Russia? What do you think? What about Russian students at SMU? Send them home? I couldn't bring myself to do it. I draw the line there, but that may just be me. Otherwise, there is a strong argument to be made that at some level, people have to be responsible for the decisions of their leaders. But do you see the issue now? It's not without its problems, but when New Year's 2022, did you expect we would be talking with this kind of moral clarity on an issue? Any issue. Absolutely extraordinary. Now, I will tell you that most of the corporate efforts in this way are stumbling, halting, confused, trying to hire consultants to tell them, how to pray. They don't, it's a difficult sort of problem for them. They are most effective when they are narrowly focused on a particular issue, like disinformation or psychological problems and the second order effects of all these feeds, or the Russian war. What is happening, in fact, is most of them are merging. The latest studies as of yesterday are that the companies that have left are actually, even with the billions of dollars of hits they've taken, are actually doing better than the ones that have stayed. Why, how, I don't know. But the hard part, the fascinating part is suppose that were not true. Suppose, in fact, it would be a monetary cost to do what you believe would be the right thing to do. That's when the issue comes up. And that's when increasingly, it's been happening for a long time. We've been protesting divestment in South Africa since the 70s. We've been worrying about the seals. We've been worrying about nuclear power. We've been protesting stuff since before it was cool. But when it comes at a defined cost to the shareholders and you do it anyway, it happens here that most of the shareholders, that is, say, the opinion, is moving in the same direction. The interesting point, the hard point for corporations as for individuals is what happens when you have to pay for your principles. There are pockets of consensus that are driving some of these. It's very hard to find it. It's very hard to find it. But as a general rule, yes, the decisions right now, the decisions to leave and refuse any more commerce or society with Russia are widely agreed upon. Great question is, how long is that going to last once the effect of them cutting off the gas to Poland and Germany or whatever really starts to take effect, and you wind up having to pay monetarily and in other ways for what you think. These are not easy issues. People are afraid, and the underlying fear that Putin won't stop unless he stopped here. And that certainly is true. There have been enough astonishments in this particular case to last us for a long time. And we'll suppose we come back to that in the moment I claim left. Let's end up with the individual. You know, how do we, even we here, respond to these problems and these issues? And I have essentially 3 suggestions. Number one, ask why. Ask, most valuable question you ever ask is why. Start asking why more frequently. Here's an example. When I was a puppy lawyer, I worked very closely with a private investigator named Martin Brown. Remember the TV show, The Rockford Files? The actor James Garner, Martin spit an image of James Garner in his young days. And Martin taught me an enormous amount. He was an old detective, and he taught me an enormous amount. And one of the most valuable things he taught me was, when somebody calls and wants to tell you something, ask yourself, why is he telling me this? Is it to get a reaction out of me? Is it to find out what I know? Is it to see how I react? Ask why somebody is putting this in front of you. Ask why a lot. This means you must reevaluate. In today's world, you must reevaluate what I call your patterns of trust. Over a lifetime, you have built up a certain pattern, topography of whom you trust, when you trust them, to what extent, how you trust, what kind of proof you need, and so on. A huge amount of that needs to be reevaluated in light of new technology. Ask why all the time and reevaluate your patterns of trust. What you used to think was authoritative, you may now think is authoritative because back then there was general consensus on it, Uncle Walter Cronkite or whatever. And now you may have persuaded yourself that something is authoritative because you like what you're hearing. At this point, that no longer works. And in fact, in many ways, you can't even trust your eyes and ears because this stuff's too manipulable. I mean, What has the world come to when I'm telling you can't trust your own eyes and ears? Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. Number two, beware of your addictions. Beware of your addictions, especially to news feeds, because the way the algorithms work is they continually feed you what you express interest in, what you like, and so on. And what most people like are things that get them excited and worked up. Get you more excited, more worked up. And what you need is perspective. You didn't arrive at this point in your lives by only hearing one consistent set of things. It's terribly easy to become addicted to this stuff now and hear only one particular set of things. I will tell you that a few months ago, there was a wonderful story that a bunch of researchers paid 600 or 800 dedicated, committed Fox News watchers, paid them to watch CNN for a month. It took paying them. Paid them to watch CNN for a month. And they came back, changed people, and said, I didn't know that. Why wasn't I hearing this? Why didn't I know all this? And I will tell you that they did the same thing to CNN guys, and they came back and said the same thing. Why didn't I know all this? See, beware of your addictions. Beware of becoming addicted to particular commentators or particular sorts of things. The most devastating thing I ever heard one time was, speaking of one commentator, there's a person who was a fan said, oh, he's a smart guy. And the fan's old friend, who was, old and trusted friend, responded, no, he's not. He's a dumb guy's idea of what a smart guy sounds like. Beware of your addictions. And number three, learn the proper use of the phrase, I don't know. The phrase, I don't know, can be your most powerful friend, can be incredibly powerful, especially when you think about the things that you don't realize you don't know, the things you don't realize you don't know. That's the things, the surprises are the things you really want to be worried about. But there's a tremendous amount out there also of what Twain used to say, it's not what I don't know that worries me. What worries me is what I know that isn't true. The I don't know can be your most powerful friend, but there's a caveat to this too, which is, right, Karl Marx, as in Marxism, used to say that in order to bring about this new world that he foresaw coming inevitably, the idea was not to convince people that you were speaking the truth. The idea was to put them in despair of being able to figure out who was speaking the truth. I don't trust anybody. I don't trust either one of them. They're all saying they're just as sorry. Every one of them is sorry. I don't know what to think. I don't know what to believe anymore. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Beware of that. And I conclude with thanks and a sort of benediction, which I think is the single, in a world which is increasingly frightening and changing every minute, increasingly, I think, helpful, is the great message of the Christian faith and of the gospel. Fear not, for I make all things new.